Hey up, right, week before last I published a video about developments in the EU over net zero policies where the internal combustion engine has sort of been given a reprieve from 2035. Now, I'd sort of dragged my heels over that video because I didn't think people would be that interested in it, but as it turns out, so far in the entire history of this channel, it has been the best performing video so far. Even now, a week and a half later, it's getting 1 to 1.5 thousand views per hour, and it's attracted over 2,000 comments. It's just as I speak now about to tip 300,000 views, which is pretty damn good by this channel's standards. Now, the internal combustion engine has become a very emotive subject in modern society, with practical people, which means most of society, realising that you can't just ban them and expect civilization to continue to develop. It won't. It'll go into freefall. And the climate and net zero fanatics, or should I call them zealots, purporting the internal combustion engine to be the devil's work and it must be eradicated at all costs. Over the last week and a half, I have read every single one of those comments. I haven't replied to many because, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, there just isn't enough hours in the day for me to be able to do that. And for the most part, the comments were sort of what I expected them to be. Now, the big pushback against this news was, of course, from the climate zealots. They want us to ride bicycles, or they want us to walk, or worst case scenario, they want us to use electric vehicles. And many governments, including our government here in the UK, are working from exactly the same rule book, ignoring all other alternatives for travel and for heating our homes, etc., even if those alternatives could potentially help the planet in so many ways. There's a strange blinkered mindset sort of pervading every part of society over travel and energy in general that advocates that instead of learning lessons and doing better, what we actually should be doing is regressing to a state where the human race, to atone for the sins of its fathers, needs to adopt a meaner, smaller, colder and more hungry lifestyle going forward in order to save the planet. To that end, I've discovered with these climate zealots is that the minds are absolutely closed. There is only one route to saving the planet from this perceived era of destruction, and they are absolutely in no way whatsoever willing to look at alternatives that might actually be better. These people are actually the opposite of progression. They flat refuse to acknowledge the limitations of the technologies that they put forward as the solution, and refuse to acknowledge the potential existence of any other alternative, which obviously is very frustrating for the rest of the population capable of critical thinking. Now, I did make a little faux pas in that video. I referred to e-fuels in the same context as biofuels, intimating that they are virtually the same thing. They're not. E-fuel is, for the most part, a theoretical technology. It's a very difficult technology to put into action successfully, and it's also a very power-hungry process. Now, I'm not saying for one moment that it's not the future. It could well be, but there are a lot of hurdles to overcome before that happens. Biofuels are, a different kettle of fish, if you like. This is the production of a fuel of one sort or of another from vegetable biomass. It's been around as an industrial process certainly since the early 1990s, when They told us we were running out of oil, but we didn't. And a lot of effort was put into perfecting the production of rapeseed oil to produce a kind of diesel. Now, this didn't work out because we didn't run out of oil. And producing fuel from rapeseed was quite, again, energy intensive, which made it expensive. So for the most part, it fell by the wayside. Now, one of the big negative comment subjects that cropped up in that video is that to make biofuels requires a huge amount of land. We already don't have enough land to grow crops to feed people, so I'm very naughty and selfish for suggesting that we can grow vegetable biomass and produce fuel so that we can continue to use the internal combustion engine. I'm an evil man, and I'm representative of everything that is evil about this world. Now, my short response to this is, you're all a bit thick, and you really ought to pick up a book from time to time and try to keep abreast with what's going on in the world. The longer and more intelligent reply to, this sort of comment is this. Actually, you don't need any land to grow the biomass vegetation required for producing biofuels. Right, let's start at the beginning. There isn't a shortage of land for growing food on this planet. What there is a shortage of is fertilizer. Now, there are two reasons for that shortage. One is a certain conflict in Europe where a lot of our fertilizer supplies come from, causing a shortage, and the other is government policy in, again, various parts of the world that see fertilizer as being evil, because that fertilizer gets washed off the land into freshwater waterways and eventually reaches the sea, where it's causing a little bit of a problem with a rise in nitrate and phosphate levels in our oceans. I'll come on to that a little bit later on. So as a result of this, various governments are putting restrictions on how much or on whether any fertilizer can be used for the production of crops. Now, what this results in is a lower yield of crops. So everyone's reported, low crop yields. It's not rocket science. A lot of farmland is only producing half its normal crop yield because they're unable to use fertilizer or they're unable to use it in sufficient quantities, which in turn is helping to fuel the cost of living crisis. Low yields mean higher prices, and this is all in an effort to stop the contamination of our oceans with nitrates and phosphates. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm more than most people appreciates the problem of nitrates and phosphates in the oceans. It is a big problem. But what if we could do something about that? What if we could use those nitrates and phosphates to produce biomass, which can be turned into fuel and natural fertilizer? Now, I personally don't have any expertise in using biomass to produce fuel, but we do know that seaweed can be used to produce biofuel. We also know that burning that biofuel will only release as much CO2 as was taken up by that seaweed while it was growing. And seaweed removes nitrates and phosphates very efficiently from seawater. But there are more benefits to it even than that. Seaweed is becoming a major problem in our oceans because of those excess nitrates and phosphates. It's growing to almost plague-like proportions and causing all sorts of problems. But seaweed in itself, because it is high in nitrates and phosphates, makes a very good natural fertilizer. A lot of cultures have been using it for fertilizing poor soil for hundreds of years. So it's got two uses. Well, actually, it also has a third use. If it's gathered together in certain areas where it's constrained in our oceans and not allowed to just float free and go wherever it wants. It provides a very dense forest which is useful for other types of life. It provides a safe haven for, certain microscopic forms of life. It also provides a safe haven for larval fish. Because most marine fish are born as larvae, they have to go through a very hazardous life cycle of metamorphosis before they actually become fully formed fish. So potentially, carefully managing these forests of seaweed could increase fish stocks by enhancing their probability of survival. Now, I've never produced biofuel from seaweed, but I have an intimate practical knowledge in culturing this stuff, which goes back about 25 years. And I'll quickly explain why. I've been a reef keeper since my late teens. Back then, keeping invertebrates and marine fish was considered almost impossible, and there were no real advances made in making it any easier. The scientists, the marine biologists, had no interest in creating captive systems for the specimens that they studied, because they relied on either observing them in the wild or dissecting them when they'd been removed from the ocean. They had no interest in keeping them alive, so it was left to hobbyists like me all over the world to develop viable systems that would allow us not only to keep marine organisms alive, but even to breed them or propagate invertebrate species. Now, as well as breeding marine fish like clownfish, which was my speciality, I also propagated live corals, hard corals and soft. But the biggest challenge in a captive environment was keeping nitrate and phosphate levels low enough for them to flourish, which is a challenge in a small captive system. Most marine organisms biologically secrete ammonia as a byproduct of breathing and normal bodily functions. The ammonia in an aquarium is processed using bacteria to turn ammonia into nitrite, which is just as dangerous as ammonia. We then use a different type of bacteria to turn nitrite into nitrate, and a byproduct of that is, in the later stages, phosphates will start to be produced in low quantities, but equally as harmful if they're allowed to build up in the system. Back in the mid-1990s, nitrate and phosphate was a major issue if you wanted to keep corals successfully, let alone propagate them. And like a lot of other hobbyists around the world, we adopted what were known as algal scrubbers to remove nitrates and phosphates from the water. Now, this was actually technology borrowed from sewage plants and certain waste water plants, used to remove the similar elements from the water to purify it. And we used a porous media, often a type of sponge, in a sort of trickle tower or trickle filter, which would encourage the growth of filamentous algae suspended in a very thin film of water circulated from the main tank, which would allow these filamentous algae to remove nitrates and phosphates fairly efficiently from the total volume of the system water. And by the early 2000s, we'd taken that a step further in implementing what was known as a refugium. This was a separate tank where macroalgae, we usually used Caulerpa species like Certuloides, Taxifolia or Prolifera, which were lit 24 hours because, Caulerpa is one of the only plant species on Earth that can take light 24 hours a day without breaking down. In fact, providing it has sufficient nutrients, it actually thrives under 24-hour lighting. And it became a self-regulating nitrate and phosphate remover. It would grow at a fantastic rate when sufficient nutrients were available. It could literally double or treble in biomass in a week. When nutrient levels were under control, it would simply stop growing or slow down substantially. And if you had too much biomass in the refugium, you could simply take it out by the handfuls and put it on the compost heap, and it would serve as a really good nutritious fertilizer for the garden. Now, this would often be a separate tank about half the size of the main display tank, and it was called a refugium because none of the marine life in the display tank were able to get access to it. So all sorts of microfauna, everything from copepods to small filter feeding worms, mysids, small starfish, would not only survive in there because nothing ate them, they would breed, and it would create a second ecosystem in the tank, or should I say in the system. And this calaper would also remove dissolved carbon dioxide from the system water and produce oxygen, so it kept the whole system super saturated with oxygen because you were lighting it 24 hours a day. So I know the mechanics of macroalgae and how it can biologically remove carbon dioxide, nitrate and phosphate from the water very efficiently. Now, in our oceans, there is a species of seaweed. It's a brown seaweed, so not quite as efficient as calaper for removing nitrates and phosphates, so you would need it in huge quantities. And due to this washout of agricultural land, that is exactly what we have in our oceans. Millions and millions of tons of the stuff. Most government organisations are ignoring it, apart from sort of complaining about the problems that it causes. But other than that, they're leaving it pretty much alone. So come winter, it dies off and it releases that carbon dioxide and all those nitrates and phosphates back into the ocean. It just goes to waste when really someone should be collecting it. Now, there are various companies around the world that are trying to set up a sort of industry in capturing this seaweed, corralling it into huge fields on the ocean, which is quite easy because it floats, with a view to utilising it for carbon capture. But they're struggling because no one really wants to invest in it. A few weeks ago, it was announced that our government had actually awarded a grant of £250,000 to one of these companies to do further research on using this seaweed for carbon capture, but with a view to collecting this seaweed together, baling it up, and then sinking it in deep parts of the ocean where that carbon dioxide will be tied up deep in the ocean for decades, maybe longer, because presumably the low temperatures at very deep depths will stop it from breaking down, so the carbon dioxide won't be released for a long time. Basically, it's a silly system where they put a lot of effort into capturing the seaweed and then kicking the can down the road with it. Because ultimately, the carbon dioxide, the nitrates and the phosphates will all be dumped back into the ocean at some stage in the future, instead of putting it to good use as a renewable form of fuel and fertilizer. Now, some of the sources that I use to reference this, I will make the links available in the video description down below, suggest that the amount of carbon expended actually harvesting this stuff and, transforming it into fuel and fertilizer is far lower than carrying out a similar process with Terra-based plants. And by using special enzymes, this seaweed can be broken down into something similar to palm oil, which will provide a far higher grade fuel than the ethanol that we're used to producing from, plant biomass from land-grown plants. And this isn't science fiction. It's science fact. We know it can be done. It's been tried. It would have to be done on an industrial scale, but, you know, oil and gas has to be extracted on an industrial scale. It will be far easier to extract seaweed than extracting oil and gas. So it's pretty much 100% renewable. The ocean is very efficient at reabsorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. So if used in internal combustion engines, it wouldn't contribute any more CO2 to the atmosphere than already exists. And of course, at the same time, it would clean up our oceans. It's basically a win-win-win-win situation. The nitrate and phosphate byproducts of this process can be used to continue to fertilise arable land, promoting food production. And the conspiracy theorist in me says the only reason that no one will look at it seriously as an alternative to batteries is that perhaps it simply just doesn't fit their agenda. I used to run a 100-gallon tank, and I would pull calepa biomass out of the refugium by the bucketful every weekend. I know how prolific it can be. I'm not stupid. I know it wouldn't be all plain sailing. I know there would be hurdles to overcome. But I believe those hurdles are far smaller than those facing EV technology. And I know that if it's done correctly, it won't cause the devastation that EV technology is causing. And it is sustainable and fully renewable, unlike EV technology. Now, Sargassum generally grows in fairly warm seas, which could make it very profitable for, developing nations. And many of the, for want of a better word, Sargassum seas are international waters. So access to this resource is going to be very easy for everyone. Now, I thought I would make this video really just to provide you with food for thought. We're routinely told that the world is going to end, that we're running out of energy, that we can't use the internal combustion engine anymore. I think recently here in the UK we've even been told that they're probably going to start water rationing in the near future. There's absolutely no reason why we should accept that if proper research is not being put into potential resources like this. I mean, the £250,000 that I cited earlier on that the government had pledged to this company for carbon capture using seaweed is an infinitesimally small amount compared to the huge amounts of cash that they've thrown at wild goose chases over other renewable energies, many of which have resulted in nothing and in some cases bankruptcy. Do a bit of reading on the subject and see what you think. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. You could, if you like, lend support by means of Patreon or through the super thanks button down below. Other than that, I would appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you do subscribe, hit the notification bell and ensure that your notifications are enabled. That way YouTube will hopefully let you know whenever I upload a new video. I will of course be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.